US tariffs have wounded China.
Chinese markets deep in the red. Now, Hong Kong stocks plunged the most in almost 3 decades.
In its first day of trading after the weekend, the Shanghai Composite fell more than 7 percentage points. That's, let's call it, somewhere in the ballpark of $500 billion in value, wiped out in one day. The Hang Seng, a measure of top stocks in the Hong Kong market, that was down more than 13%. That's another few $100 billion in value gone. And Donald Trump's not done. Because on top of a 10% tariff on Chinese goods imposed in February, plus another 10% in March, plus 34% announced last week, he's just threatened an additional 50%, which altogether effectively doubles the import cost of all Chinese goods to the US.
We're starting to get to the point where if all these are applied, you effectively create an embargo between the two countries where there's just going to be no trade.
Trump is punishing China for hitting back. In a trade war, the US has escalated. Yesterday, Trump says, China issued retaliatory tariffs of 34%. If China does not withdraw its 34% increase, the United States will impose additional tariffs on China of 50% effective April 9th. But China has found a way to hit the US back hard, and not just with tariffs, but by attacking its supply chain directly.
China is messaging this quite clearly. They are in it until the end.
China has, until now, attempted to exercise restraint. Months ago, when Trump first imposed that sweeping 10% tariff on Chinese goods coming into the US, China did retaliate, but with smaller sector-specific tariffs, mainly targeting US energy. Coal, LNG, that sort of thing. Then, when the US stacked another 10% tariff on China, once again, we saw a measured response, this time against US agriculture, targeting very specific things like chicken and beef. But responding to Trump's additional 34% tariff announced last week.
So we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset?
Well, they're upset. Retaliating with an equivalent 34% tariff on American goods. This is China hitting back harder than before. But China knows hitting the US back with tariffs doesn't land quite the same way as the original blow against China. The trade math illustrates why. If we're talking about the physical things the two countries ship back and forth, in 2024, the US sold China just over $140 billion worth of goods, but it bought almost $440 billion of product, meaning a 34% tariff on Chinese goods, that has a bigger impact than that same tariff going the other way. So China didn't stop at just the tariff.
Well, China raised the stakes. It announced a raft of countermeasures, export curbs on tungsten and other rare metals.
China controls about 90% of the world's known supply of what are called rare earths, as in the stuff that makes electric engines run and fighter jets fly. They are the elements of the periodic table, some of which you likely never bothered to learn because they had such wildly arcane names like dysprosium and ytterbium. But if you're building an electric vehicle and you need a way to keep your neodymium magnets from weakening under extreme temperatures, you are heat-proofing with dysprosium. If US Marines are carrying out a nighttime raid and those soldiers need night vision goggles, you're converting infrared light into something visible with terbium. China recently added 7 new categories of rare earths to a list of controlled materials, which now requires US companies that need them to get a license for them.
They're realizing that they don't have to respond in the same level playing field of tariff for tariff. Instead, they have other tools they can use to impose costs on the United States.
This latest move adds to a growing list of rare earths China has either restricted or actually banned the export of to the United States. And experts say China has tailored this list of raw materials to exactly what the US needs. Some American aerospace manufacturers, for example, build avionics using materials that are sole sourced from China.
The US and others have stockpiles, but they will go through those stockpiles relatively quickly. And the Chinese are counting on this being one pressure point to get the US to back off.
And if you want to understand what direction China's actions are taking the country, it's also worth paying attention to their words, branding U.S. tariffs as abuse, which severely infringes upon the legitimate rights and interests of all countries, severely violates World Trade Organization rules, severely undermines the rules-based multilateral trading system, and severely disrupts the global economic order. It goes on to warn, economic bullying that shifts risks onto others will ultimately backfire.
They've been accusing the U.S. of bullying ever since the initial trade war. They want to be respected. They want to feel like they can have a two-sided, not a one-sided negotiation over these issues, and they don't want to feel threatened by the U.S.
Trump believes China has badly cheated the United States. He accuses China of flooding world markets with unfairly subsidized cheap goods, which wreaks havoc on a country's ability to manufacture and provide for itself because they just can't compete. And you recall that chart we showed you earlier about how much more the US buys from China than it sells to China, the US running a trade deficit of nearly $300 billion. Trump sees that as proof that China must be ripping the US off.
Trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life.
But every expert we've ever talked to on the subject says that's entirely the wrong way to look at it.
There's nothing inherently good or bad about a trade surplus or a deficit. The United States has had a trade deficit pretty much since the end of the Second World War. Why is that? Because they're richer than any other country, so they buy more stuff.
Just to use an analogy, they're like we as households, we as consumers, we have trade surpluses and trade deficits with different entities in the economy. Most of us run a massive trade deficit with our grocery store. Most of us have a massive trade surplus with our employer, but we don't buy anything from them. Are these things that are problems that we need to remedy? So in some sense, the underlying premise that bilateral trade imbalances are necessarily bad is just wrong.
But what makes interpreting what Trump truly wants from any fight he picks really difficult is that his goals are sometimes self-contradicting. For example, on the one hand, he claims to love tariffs, like the ones imposed on China, because of all the revenue raised by charging the American companies who pay those tariffs.
We're going to start being very wealthy again. We're going to be wealthy as a country because they've taken so much of our wealth away from us.
But he also claims the purpose of tariffs is to do the exact opposite, which is to convince enough American companies not to pay them and instead bring manufacturing back to America. And other times, he seems to see tariffs simply as a club with which he can beat his opponents to extract concessions on things that have nothing to do with trade at all, like the push to get the Chinese company behind TikTok to sell its US operations to an American buyer. Quote, maybe I'll give them a little reduction in tariffs or something to get it done. But what is unavoidably clear is that while Trump is in no way the original source of friction between the US and China. I mean, this has been an adversarial relationship for a long, long time. And now this trade war has gone to a new, explicitly hostile level.